This is a Falcon, and this is the controller. What do you get when you combine the two together? A Falcon controller. And while no, it can't control Falcons, it can control tens of thousands of pixels in your display, all from within this board. This is the latest controller from Falcon Controllers, and it is the F16v5 pixel controller. So many new features, and I'm going to cover how to use all of it and how to run your display off of this new Falcon controller in this video. So, let's get started. So if you're new here, my name is Nick and welcome to How To Pixel. On this channel, I have tons of tutorials about how to set up your own light display for Christmas, Halloween, any display you want to set up, and how you can program it, how you get all the controllers and computers to work, and every little detail about it. The channel mainly focuses on how to use smart pixel lights, which are a lot more advanced than regular Christmas lights, but they are programmable and you can make the strand of lights do whatever you want. Any bulb can be any color at any time. So if you're brand new to smart pixels and you want to learn how they work and how to use them, I recommend you check out this playlist of beginner tutorials I've made, because a lot of these other videos are a little bit more advanced and your head might go crazy if you don't understand some other things first. But if you already know the basics on how to use smart pixels, then you can keep watching about this awesome new controller. To keep this from being one massive video, I'm going to split it up into two parts. In this first part, I'm going to explain all the components on the controller, what each thing does on here, what the buttons do, the Ethernet ports, all of that. And then in the second part, I'm going to go over how to use the web interface and how you program the controller to be able to run your own pixels. If you want to skip right to a certain part of the tutorial, I'll have timestamps in the scrub bar and in the description below. So if you want to get in right to the tutorial about how this works, then skip to this time right here. But first, I'm going to go over the new features on this board and a couple of other things first. So like I said, this is called the F16. The reason for that is because there are 16 pixel ports on here. The F stands for Falcon, so it's the Falcon 16 port controller. This is version 5, the newest, and they've had 4 other versions before. And I'd say this is a pretty huge version because they've added a ton of stuff. The first thing you'll notice if you're used to seeing the F16v4 or v3 is there's no more fuses down here. There used to be 16 automotive fuses that went to each port. That way it can protect the controller, no fires can be started, nothing can blow up. But you'll notice there are no more fuses down here. And that is because the F16v5 has switched from automotive fuses to E-fuses or electronic fuses, which you can reset right in the web interface. So no more blowing a fuse and having to take it out and replace it. If you blow the fuse, you can go on the web interface and hit reset yourself. You can also turn on and off all of the fuses yourself too, which is pretty cool. So that's one of the things you might immediately notice. The other thing you might immediately notice is there are 4 new Ethernet ports at the top, but the spot to plug in an expansion board is gone. Well, the reason for that is Falcon Controllers decided to just get rid of that and put the expansion board right into the controller. So no more having to have a separate board that you would hook a ribbon cable between the controller and there if you want to expand the board. It already has a differential expansion basically built into it right here. So these are differential receiver outputs, and you can plug in smart receivers of different shapes and sizes into the board to get more ports. But you might be thinking, what if you want the short range expansion board? The one that would stay here and give you an extra 16 ports so you can have 32 ports right here. Well, you can still do that with this controller. You can add multiple receivers down here, but it might be a little hard having to run an Ethernet cable to each one. So coming out soon for the V5 series, there's also going to be an F32 controller that has 32 ports built into it. So that controller might suit you better, but this one I personally love because I used to have my F16v3 and then a differential expansion board, but it was really annoying having to have all of that in one box. But now I can plug my receivers right into here, and any pixels that are close to the board, I can hook them up right here. Another thing that also came out with the V5 series is the V5 differential receivers. The new receivers also have E-fuses on them, and they have two-way talk between the controller and the receivers. All of the ports on the V5 controller and V5 receivers can measure the amperage live and show you how many amps is being used on each port in the web interface. And the receivers can talk back to the controller so you can see the voltage going to the receivers, the temperature of the receivers, and reset the fuses on the receivers from here as well. If you still have older receivers like the V2, V3, V4, those will still work on here, you just won't get the two-way talk. And some of those receivers you can't have more than one. There's a whole specification sheet. I'll put it in the description. There are a lot of other new features, but I'm going to save that for later in the tutorial. But now, let's jump into what all the components do on the board in the actual tutorial. Beginning at the top half of the board and working our way down, you'll notice there are 7 different Ethernet ports on the board. 5 are color-coded red and the other 2 are black. The black Ethernet ports are the network ports. These act like normal Ethernet ports and allow the controller to connect to the internet as well as connect to your show player. Your show player's data for the lights will be sent into one of these 2 Ethernet ports. If you don't know what a show player is, don't worry about it for now. It's just the main computer that sends the data to your controller or controllers. The 2 Ethernet ports act as a network switch and can allow you to daisy chain multiple controllers off of one Ethernet connection. For example, if I have 2 controllers, I can have the main data come in from my show player into this Ethernet port, giving data to the controller, then have the data for the next controller come out of the other Ethernet port, going that way. You should never plug network data into any of the 5 red Ethernet ports, as they weren't designed for that. Speaking of red Ethernet ports, next I'm going to talk about those on the top of the board. These 4 red Ethernet ports allow you to chain smart differential receivers off the main board to give you more pixel ports. This is basically a differential expansion board built into the controller. If you've used an older model of the F16, you'll know that there's a spot to plug in an expansion board, and you can hook up a differential expansion board to give you more Ethernet ports for these smart receivers. Well, with the F16v5, it basically has that built in, and that's what these 4 Ethernet ports are. The board already has 16 ports built into it, but you can add smart receivers of different sizes to get you even more ports. There's a lot more to dive in about with smart receivers, but we'll get to that later in the video. The final red Ethernet port on the right side of the controller is for DMX, LOR, or Renard controllers or devices. If you're going to be running just pixels in your display, then you probably won't need this Ethernet port. However, if you have DMX items in your show, such as a fog machine or a moving headlight, or you want to run an LOR or Renard controller with the F16v5, then you'd use this Ethernet port. The Ethernet port can output 1 universe of data and can be set up inside the controller's web interface for what type of data to output. If you look to the left of the Ethernet port, you'll notice 3 jumpers. You use these to set the Ethernet port to output either DMX or LOR data. If you want to use DMX data, keep all 3 jumpers between the middle and right pin. If you want to use LOR data, keep all 3 jumpers between the middle and left pin. If you want to use Renard data, you'll have to make a custom cable. By looking at this diagram, you can see the pinouts for the Ethernet port and what each one does. Like I said though, if you're using just pixels off the controller, then you don't need to worry about any of this. Like with the network Ethernet ports, you should only plug DMX, LOR, or Renard boards or devices into this Ethernet port. The same goes for the smart receivers as well. You should only plug smart receivers into the top 4 red Ethernet ports. Plugging any of these items into the wrong Ethernet port could cause permanent damage to the controller. Next, in the top left corner of the F16v5, there's a Wi-Fi chip that allows you to connect the controller to a network without an Ethernet cable. This can be useful for making changes to the controller via the web interface without needing to have a hardwired connection. It's also used as a Wi-Fi hotspot for when the board does not detect a Wi-Fi or Ethernet connection. You can connect to its Wi-Fi network to make changes on the web interface, but you won't have any internet connection. The Wi-Fi chip can also now be used when the controller is in any mode, unlike older models. It used to only work in master, remote, and standalone mode, but now it works in every other mode. However, all pixel data from your show must still be sent through an Ethernet cable into one of the black Ethernet ports. This is because it's too much to send over Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi chip only supports 2.4 GHz Wi-Fi networks, and the range for it is very low. You can purchase an ESP-07 IPEX connector antenna online that can be connected to the Wi-Fi chip and increase its range. The button next to the Wi-Fi chip is used to reset it if it's not working properly. If you look between the black and red Ethernet ports, there's a connector labeled fan. This is if you'd like to attach a fan to the board to prevent it from overheating. In my experience, I've never needed a fan, especially because the controller is outside and below freezing temperatures. However, if you'd like to add a fan, you can connect it here and control what temperature it turns on at in the web interface. The top pin is ground, the second pin is positive, the third pin is not used, and the fourth pin is the PWM pin. If you are connecting a fan, make sure it's the same voltage as what you're inputting into the V2 power jack on the board. If you're running the controller at 5 volts, you must use a 5 volt fan. If you're running the controller at 12 volts, you must use a 12 volt fan. Next, all the way to the top right of the controller, there are 2 connectors you'll see labeled input 1 and input 2. These are input triggers you could set up to trigger different events inside the controller's web interface. You can do all sorts of things such as start a test pattern, turn off all the lights, reboot the controller, turn on or off the fuses, or even trigger an FPP command slot if you're using Falcon Player as your show player. You can connect a button, a switch, or anything that completes the circuit for the input connector to trigger the event. If you look below the third smart receiver Ethernet port, there's a 6-pin connector. This connector is used to control an audio board to allow the F16v5 to output sound. If you want the F16v5 to output audio, you can find the board on Pixel Controllers' website for around $20. The audio board will only work if the controller is in standalone or master mode, so if you have a main show player, it's better to just have your audio output there. Below the audio output, there's a switch which we'll come back to later, but to the left of the switch is a micro SD card slot. This is used to give the controller storage for holding sequences, media, and other files. It also used to be used to update the firmware on the board, but now you can do that straight from the web interface. If you're using the controller in DDP, ZCPP, or E1.31/ArtNet mode, which is the most common, then you will not need an SD card. E131/ArtNet mode is the mode where the controller takes data from your show player to output to the pixels, and is probably what most of you will be using. Remote, master, and player mode will all need the sequences for the pixels stored on the controller, and that's when you'll need an SD card. The card slot is a friction slot and is not spring-loaded, so insert the card with the notches towards the bottom of the controller and the SD card's logo facing the right. Then push down until the SD card is fully in the slot. On the left side of the board, there's an OLED screen with 6 different buttons around it. When the board is powered, the screen will show you information about the controller, such as uptime, its IP address, temperature, voltage, and other things. You can use the up, down, and left and right buttons to navigate the menus, as well as the select button. You can even change some settings for the controller via the screen, but I recommend using the web interface when possible because it's a lot easier to navigate. Under the screen, there's a watch battery slot to allow the controller to keep the time and date even when there is no power. However, as long as your controller has an internet connection, you won't need this since it can get the time and date when it boots up. If your controller won't have internet access and you're using it in master or player mode, you'll want to use a battery then. The test/boot button is used to run test modes on the pixels. If you push the button once, it will activate a test pattern on all the lights set up in the web interface. If you look at the 3 LEDs below the micro SD card slot, the third LED will light up to signify that the controller is in test mode. The first LED is to indicate the board has power, and the second LED will light up if the controller is working and not in test mode. If you use the arrow buttons, you can go to the test menu on the screen and select a different test pattern to run while the controller is in test mode. You can push the test button once again to turn off the testing pattern. The final item on the upper half of the controller is the external fuse control outputs. This can be used to reset the fuses on F8 power distribution boards with E-fuses. All you have to do is hook 2 wires between the terminals on the controller and the fuse control terminals on the distribution boards, and then you can control the fuses from the web interface on the controller. Moving on to the bottom half of the controller, now we're going to talk about how you power the F16v5 and all the pixel output ports. The board has 2 main power inputs, usually labeled a V1 and V2 on the bottom left and right corners of the controller. I say usually because my controller for some reason shows V2 on both terminals. This was probably an error when they were printing the board, but this is the V1 terminal on the left and this is the V2 terminal on the right. The V1 terminal only powers pixel ports 1 through 8. Powering this terminal will not give power to the controller or pixel ports 9 through 16. It will just give power to the pixels that are on ports 1 through 8. The V2 terminal powers pixel ports 9 through 16 and the rest of the controller. The controller will not turn on or do anything unless there is power coming in from the V2 power terminal. Both terminals are rated for a max of 32 amps each and can accept 5 to 13 DC volts. Make sure you pay special attention when you're wiring your controller to the power supply, as the grounds on each terminal are on opposite sides. The V1 terminal has ground on the left and positive on the right. The V2 terminal has positive on the left and ground on the right. If you take a look at the back of the board, this is so the grounds can be connected together. Going back to the switch I skipped earlier, this is the input voltage switch. This switch must be set to the amount of voltage that is going to the controller. Since right now the power for the controller and the components are coming in through the V2 power terminal, then we need to set this switch based on the voltage coming into V2. So if you're powering the V2 terminal with 7 to 13 DC volts, keep the switch towards the left. If you're powering the V2 terminal with 5 volts, keep the switch to the right. It is very important you set this before powering the board. If the switch is set incorrectly, it will damage the controller. Never plug the controller directly into 120 or 240 AC volts found in residential outlets. This will completely destroy the controller. Only use DC power between 5 and 13 volts. If you don't have a way to get this voltage, I'd recommend getting a Meanwell power supply for either 5 or 12 volts. They plug into either 120 or 240 volts from a residential outlet, and then they convert the power to DC power, either 5 or 12 volts, depending on which power supply you buy. They're great for running light shows, and I have 7 in my show. I'll leave a link to them in the description. Since the V1 and V2 power terminals are separate, this allows you to mix what voltage pixels you run in your show. For example, you can have 5 volt pixels on ports 1 through 8 with a 5 volt power supply plugged into the V1 terminal, then have 12 volt pixels on ports 9 through 16 with a 12 volt power supply plugged into the V2 terminal. That 12 volt power supply will also be the voltage going to the board since it's on the V2 terminal, so you'd set the input power switch to 7 to 13 volts. If you're going to be powering the V2 terminal with 5 volts and have a lot of pixels on ports 9 through 16, the power supply's voltage may dip as the lights will be taking a lot of power. This may cause the controller to become unstable and start acting weird. So it's recommended in this case scenario to power the controller and its components with the external power terminal. If you look on the right side of the board, there's a smaller additional power terminal you can use to just power the controller itself and all the components on it, but none of the pixel outputs. You can use 5 to 13 volts, and if you're powering the V2 terminal with 5 volts, it will help the controller become more stable. To use the external power terminal, flip the switch below it up to external power. If you aren't going to be using the external power terminal and you're going to be using V2 to power the controller, make sure you keep the switch down. If you are using the external power terminal, you will still have to set the input voltage switch to the voltage that's going into the controller. This time, since the controller is being powered by the external power terminal, you'll have to set it to whatever voltage is coming in there. So if I have a 5 volt power supply on both V1 and V2, but I have a 12 volt power supply on the external power terminal to power the board, I would set the input power switch to 7 to 13 volts. Always make sure you have both of your switches in the right position before you apply power to the board. If you don't, you could damage the controller. And then the final part of the F16v5, the pixel ports. There are 16 built-in pixel outputs on the controller. Each port can control 1024 pixels if you're using 32 or less ports with all the receivers and onboard ports combined. If you're going to be using over 32 ports with the onboard ports and receiver ports combined, you can control up to 704 pixels per port. I'll discuss the different port modes in a minute, but you should know that the controller will not have enough power to support 1024 or even 704 pixels per port. It's only able to output that much data. So if you're going to have really long strands on each port, you're going to have to power inject. If you don't know what power injection is, you can find out more about it in this video. The F16v5 now features E-fuses instead of the automotive fuses on the older models. Each port is fused with a 5A E-fuse that can be reset if it's blown or switched on or off from the controller interface. All fuses are automatically reset when the board powers down and back on, and they can also be reset by holding the boot button. If a strand of pixels on a single port is going to be using over 5 amps, then you'll have to power inject to make sure you don't blow the fuse. Each port is numbered next to it, starting from 1 in the lower left corner and going to 16 in the upper right corner. As I said earlier, ports 1 through 8 are powered by the voltage coming in on V1, and ports 9 through 16, along with the rest of the controller, are powered by the voltage coming in on V2. If you have the power selection switch set for external power, then the controller will not be powered by V2. Each pixel port also has a red LED next to it that will be lit if the fuse has blown. If a fuse is blown, you can go reset it in the web interface. If only V2 has power and you're going to run your pixels off of ports 9 through 16, then all the lights for ports 1 through 8 will be lit. Don't worry though, the fuses aren't blown. This is just because there's no power coming in on V1, so the lights will automatically turn on. You'll notice each of the 16 pixel output ports have 4 terminals, but most common pixels only have 3 wires. So why are there 4 terminals then? Well, that's because the controller also supports some pixels that have 4 wires. There are certain smart pixels that have an additional clock wire, and that can be controlled by the F16v5. Do not get these 4-wire pixels confused with dumb LED pixels that also take 4 wires. Lights that have a ground and then an RGB wire, or a positive and then an RGB wire, are not smart pixels and cannot be controlled by the F16v5. These are considered dumb pixels because the whole strand must be lit up the same color and each light cannot change color. But if you have smart pixels that have 4 wires, they can be controlled by the F16v5. And if you have 3-wire pixels, those can still also be controlled by the controller. For each port, the terminal all the way to the left is ground. The ground wire on pixels will usually be black, brown, or sometimes blue. The second terminal is the clock terminal that 4-wire pixels need. If you have 3-wire pixels, then you won't be using this terminal. If you have 4-wire pixels, then your clock wire will go into this terminal. The third terminal is the data terminal, where data for the pixels is sent out. The data wire is usually yellow. The final terminal is the positive terminal, which is normally red for most wires. Don't worry about having to memorize what each terminal goes to, because right below it, there's letters to signify which each one does. G stands for ground, CLK stands for clock, D stands for data, and V stands for voltage, or the positive terminal. If the wires for your pixels are all one color and you don't know which one goes where, the wires should usually have a label on them, or you can look inside your pixel and see some sort of letters for what each one is for. You can see here inside of my pixels that there's a 12V for the positive wire, which takes 12 volts for these pixels. There's a DI wire, which stands for data in, and then there's the GND wire, which is ground. The direction of your pixels matters when you plug them into the board. You can't plug either end into the board, they must be going in one direction. Some pixels will say DI on one side and DO on the other side, and the DI stands for data in and the DO stands for data out. So you want to have your data input on the DI side, so the DI side should be the side plugged into the controller. Some pixels also even have an arrow on them to show the data flow, so just follow the arrow or the DI. If your pixels don't say anything about which way the data should flow, you should contact the manufacturer you got them from and ask if they can tell you which way the data flows. If you take the connector out, you will see that the terminals all have a gate inside. You can use a small flathead screwdriver to open or close the gate. You should put your wires inside while the gate is down, then tighten the screw to lift the gate and clamp the wires towards the top of the hole. This is the same for all the terminals on the board, including the main power terminals. Once you have your wires screwed in, you can place the connector back into the port. And now your pixels would be hooked up and ready to run as soon as you set everything up on the web interface. Now, before we finish part 1 of the tutorial, I quickly wanted to go back and talk a little bit more about the differential receiver outputs. Like I said, these allow you to add more ports to the controller if you don't have enough, or add additional ports far away in different locations. There are currently 6 different types of receivers. Some have 4 ports on them, some have 8 ports, some have 16, some can even screw directly into a power supply. However, the original smart receivers for the older controllers had 4 ports on them, so a 4-port differential receiver is kind of like the regular receiver. They now call them SR-X1 smart receivers. The name might sound confusing at first, but the SR stands for smart receiver, and the X1 is basically telling you how many ports it has. This is an SR-X2 receiver. There's a total of 8 ports on it, so it's like 2 receivers combined in one board. That's why it's called the SRX-X2, or times 2. It's because it has twice as many ports as the original receiver. This is an SR-X4 receiver. If you look at it, it has 4 times as many ports as the regular receiver, and that's why this one is called the SR-X4. I'm only going to talk about the SR-X1 receivers, or the original receivers, in this video, just to keep it simple, and in a future video, I'll explain how all the other receivers work with the controller. So if you look at the 4 receiver outputs on the controller, each one is labeled. One says 17 to 20, the next says 21 to 24, and so on. If I was to hook an SR-X1 receiver to each output, you notice that added a total of 16 ports, and now I have 32 ports on the whole controller. So if this is ports 14, 15, and 16, the next 4 ports would be 17, 18, 19, and 20. These ones would be 21, 22, 23, 24, then 25, 26, 27, 28, and finally 29, 30, 31, and 32. So that's why these are labeled. This says 17 to 20 because it controls ports 17 to 20. This one says 21 to 24 because it controls ports 21 to 24, and so on with the rest. Now with these receivers, you can hook an Ethernet cable between the controller and them and place it up to 250 feet away. This allows you to spread out differential receivers all over your display so your ports are closer to the pixels. You can even daisy chain multiple receivers off of one port, but then it gets a little bit confusing because there's a lot of things to set up. All of this is just scraping the tip of the iceberg for smart receivers. There's a whole lot more to them, but I'm going to save that for a future video because I don't want this video to be an hour long. And that's going to finish it for part 1 of the F16v5 tutorial. Now you might be thinking, oh Nick, this video took you forever to get out. I don't want to wait another 2 weeks for the other part. Well, I actually have most of the second part already completed and it should be out within a few days. This was all going to be combined into one big video, but as I was editing it, I didn't want this to be over 50 minutes long, so that's why I decided to split it up. But I will say, this controller is a revolutionary Pixel controller. So many new features and things you could do with it. And I know it was a lot of information, so if you're confused about anything, if I didn't explain anything, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. I'll try to respond as soon as I can. If part 2 of this tutorial is already out, I'll link it right up here, and I'll also put it in the end screens. But that's going to conclude it for this video. Now I have 30 minutes to go run outside and rewire this into our controller setup because the Christmas light show is starting in 30 minutes. I better go do that. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video.